They laughed at this American tank until Rommel's forces met it in battle. November 1942. The deserts of North Africa stretched endlessly beneath a scorching sun, where the fate of empires would be decided in dust and blood. As Operation Torch brought American forces crashing onto the shores of French North Africa, they carried with them a tank that had been ridiculed by critics, dismissed by armchair generals, and considered by many to be a mechanical joke on tracks. The M3 Lee, a towering, riveted monster with a design so unconventional that British tankers nicknamed it the Grant, after Ulysses S. Grant, saying it looked like a mobile tomb. American crews called it worse. Standing over 10 feet tall, with its main 75 gun mounted in a sponson on the right side of the hull rather than in a rotating turret, it seemed to embody everything wrong with American tank design. But what happened when this ridiculed machine faced the legendary Afrika Korps would silence the critics forever and prove that sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly what the moment demands. In the summer of 1940, as France collapsed and Britain stood alone, the United States faced a terrifying reality. Its armored forces were a joke. The American tank arsenal consisted primarily of M2 light tanks armed with machine guns, adequate for suppressing infantry, utterly useless against enemy armor. As panzer divisions carved through Europe with seeming ease, American military planners realized they were years behind in the arms race. The problem was time. Designing a modern tank from scratch would take years, years that America didn't have. The solution came from an unlikely compromise. Rather than wait for the perfect design, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department decided to mount a powerful 75 gun, capable of defeating German armor, onto the chassis of the M2 medium tank. But there was a critical problem. The turret ring was too small to accommodate both the 75 gun and a human crew to operate it. The answer was radical. Mount the main gun in a sponson on the right side of the hull, giving it limited traverse of only 30 degrees. A smaller 37 gun would sit in the turret above. It was a compromise that would make the tank taller, more visible, and tactically limited. But it would also make it available now, when it was desperately needed. By August 1941, the first M3 Lees rolled off production lines in Detroit. They were rushed into service with unseemly haste. British tank crews, receiving the first export models under Lend-Lease, took one look at the towering silhouette and shook their heads. At 10 feet 3 inches tall, the Lee was a foot taller than the German Panzer IV and stood out against the desert horizon like a lighthouse. The riveted construction meant that enemy shells, even if they didn't penetrate, could send red-hot rivets ricocheting inside the crew compartment, killing men without ever breaching the armor. Worst of all was that sponson-mounted 75 gun. To aim it, the entire tank had to pivot. There was no concealment, no hull-down fighting. Every engagement meant exposing the Lee's full, towering profile to enemy fire. American tankers training at Fort Knox and Fort Benning looked at their new mounts with a mixture of disbelief and dark humor. They were being asked to take this mechanical compromise into combat against the finest panzer forces in the world, commanded by a general whose name had become synonymous with armored warfare excellence, Rommel. Operation Torch launched on November 8, 1942. American and British forces struck at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers in a massive amphibious assault designed to trap Rommel's Afrika Korps between British forces advancing from Egypt and the new American-led forces pushing in from the west. For most American tankers, this would be their first taste of combat. The men of the 1st Armored Division, Old Ironsides, came ashore in Algeria equipped with a mixture of M3 Lees and lighter M3 Stuart tanks. Many of the tank commanders and drivers had never fired their weapons outside of training ranges. They had never felt the concussion of an incoming shell or smelled the acrid smoke of burning fuel and flesh. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, commanding a task force of Company C, 1st Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment, watched his Lees rumble off the landing ships with a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Waters was married to George S. Patton's daughter, but no family connection could change the reality. He was leading green crews in untested tanks against an enemy who had been perfecting their craft for 3 years. The first engagements were against Vichy French forces, confused, half-hearted battles where political allegiances mattered more than tactics. The Lees performed adequately, but they hadn't faced German armor yet. That would come soon enough. By late November, after the Vichy French forces agreed to an armistice, American forces began their push eastward. Into Tunisia. Intelligence reports confirmed what everyone feared. German reinforcements were pouring into Tunisia through ports still under Axis control. Battle-hardened panzer units, veterans of the Eastern Front and the Long Desert Campaign, were digging in around key positions. The terrain of Tunisia was unlike anything American planners had anticipated. This wasn't the open desert of Egypt and Libya where the British had been fighting. Tunisia's eastern coastal plain gave way to rugged hills and deep wadis, dried riverbeds that could hide entire tank formations. The winter rains turned dirt roads into impassable mud. Visibility, often hindered by morning fog rolling off the Mediterranean, gave defenders enormous advantages. Colonel Waters received his orders on December 1st, pushed toward Tebourba, a vital road junction 20 miles west of Tunis. German forces were reported in the area, but intelligence couldn't confirm strength or composition. It was the kind of vague information that cost lives. The column moved out at dawn. 12 M3 Lees, flanked by infantry from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and supported by a handful of Stuart light tanks for reconnaissance. The Lees rumbled forward in 2 columns, their engines roaring, tracks clinking rhythmically against the wet ground. Inside the lead Lee, Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Brooklyn commanded his crew with the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing something bad was coming but not knowing when. O'Brien had named his tank Brooklyn Brawler, painted in white letters across the sponson. The crew thought it was optimistic. O'Brien thought it was defiant. His gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, crouched in the sponson beside the 75 gun, peering through the limited vision slit. The loader, Private Danny Kowalski, checked and rechecked ammunition, armor-piercing rounds stacked within easy reach. Above them in the turret, Private Eddie Reyes operated the 37 gun while the bow gunner, Private Thomas Chen, manned the hull-mounted .30 caliber machine gun. 6 men crammed into a metal box, heading toward the unknown. By 1400 hours, the column had covered 8 miles without incident. The landscape was deceptively peaceful. Olive groves dotted the rolling hills, their ancient trees standing like silent witnesses to the coming violence. A few scattered farmhouses showed no signs of life. The local population had wisely evacuated. Then the radio crackled. The lead Stuart scout tank, half a mile ahead, reported movement. German infantry, possibly armor, near a small village designated on maps as Point 186. Colonel Waters ordered the column to halt and deploy. The Lees spread out into combat formation, their commanders scanning the horizon through binoculars. The tall profile that everyone had criticized now gave them excellent visibility. Waters could see the village clearly, whitewashed buildings clustered around a small square, perhaps 30 structures in all. What he couldn't see were the carefully camouflaged Pak 38 anti-tank guns positioned in the olive groves, or the 5 Panzer III tanks hidden in a wadi 300 yards beyond the village, or the veteran crews of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion who had been fighting in North Africa for 18 months and knew every trick of desert warfare. The Americans were about to receive their baptism of fire. The first shot came without warning. A Pak 38's 50 armor-piercing round streaked across the afternoon air and struck the lead Stuart with a sound like a massive hammer hitting an anvil. The light tank brewed up instantly, flames and black smoke erupting from its hatches. Men scrambled out, uniforms on fire, rolling in the dirt. "Contact front," Waters shouted into the radio, but his words were drowned out by the thunder of multiple anti-tank guns opening fire simultaneously. The ambush was perfect. German gunners had waited until the American column was committed, too far forward to retreat quickly, not close enough to assault with any coordination. The Lees were caught in the kill zone. Sergeant O'Brien felt Brooklyn Brawler shudder as a round glanced off the upper hull, the impact ringing through the crew compartment like a gong. "Traverse right," he screamed at his driver. "Mitchell, find me that gun." But this was the Lee's fatal flaw made manifest. To bring the 75 gun to bear, the entire tank had to turn, exposing its full profile. Mitchell could see muzzle flashes in the olive grove, but his limited vision through the sponson slit made acquiring targets agonizingly slow. Another Lee took a direct hit. The German round, fired from less than 400 yards, punched through the riveted armor on the left side. Inside, super-hot rivets exploded off the interior walls like shrapnel, killing the driver instantly and wounding the other crew members. The tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. The American formation was in chaos. Tanks were too, arcing in different directions, trying to engage targets they couldn't clearly see. The 37 guns in the turrets, designed for anti-infantry work, were nearly useless against the camouflaged anti-tank positions. Commanders stood in their open hatches, trying to direct fire, making themselves targets for German snipers who had infiltrated through the tall grass. Then the Panzer IIIs emerged from the wadi. 5 German medium tanks, their short 50 guns already firing, came over the low ridge like gray sharks rising from deep water. They moved with the confidence of veterans, spreading into a perfect assault formation, their commanders calmly directing fire through radio coordination that the Americans could only envy. Colonel Waters felt his mouth go dry. His Lees were designed as infantry support tanks, meant to engage fortified positions and suppress anti-tank guns from a distance. They were never intended for the kind of mobile tank-on-tank combat that the Germans had perfected on the Russian steppes and in the desert against the British. The range closed to 300 yards. German rounds were slamming into the American tanks with increasing accuracy. A third Lee took a catastrophic hit, the round penetrating the sponson and detonating the 75 ammunition. The explosion lifted the tank's turret clear off the hull, flipping it through the air before it crashed down 30 feet away. There were no survivors. Inside Brooklyn Brawler, Corporal Mitchell finally had a target. A Panzer III was crossing from left to right, presenting its thinner side armor. "Tank right side, 400 yards. O'Brien confirmed the target and gave the order, "Fire." The 75 gun roared, the concussion inside the sponson nearly deafening despite the crew's headphones. Mitchell watched through the smoke as the armor-piercing round struck the Panzer III just behind the turret. The German tank staggered, smoke erupting from every hatch, and ground to a halt. First blood, but the battle was far from over. The remaining 4 panzers adjusted their tactics instantly, moving evasively, using what limited cover the terrain offered. German tank commanders knew the M3 Lee's weaknesses intimately from intelligence reports and previous encounters with British Grant variants. They knew about the sponson gun's limited traverse, knew about the tall profile, knew to target the riveted hull where spalling would kill crews even without full penetration. Two more American tanks were hit in quick succession. The battlefield was now marked by pillars of black smoke rising from burning vehicles. The olive grove was alive with muzzle flashes as German infantry moved forward with Panzerfausts and magnetic mines. Colonel Waters faced an impossible choice: continue the attack and risk losing his entire force, or withdraw and abandon the wounded crewmen still trapped in damaged tanks. The radio crackled with panicked voices, contradictory reports, pleas for support. This was the crisis moment, the battle that would determine whether the M3 Lee was truly the mechanical joke its critics claimed, or whether American tankers could adapt, improvise, and overcome. What happened next would be studied in armored warfare courses for decades afterward. Sergeant O'Brien, watching another Lee brew up less than 100 yards away, made a decision that went against every instinct screaming at him to retreat. Driver, full throttle, straight at that center Panzer. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. The textbook response was to reverse, to use terrain to break contact, to live to fight another day. But O'Brien had recognized something that the German commander hadn't considered. The M3 Lee's 75mm gun, while mounted in a limited traverse sponson, fired a shell with significantly more striking power than the Panzer III's 50mm gun. At ranges under 200 yards, the Lee's 75mm could penetrate the Panzer III's frontal armor. The Germans had been fighting at what they considered optimal range, close enough for accurate fire, far enough to stay outside the effective range of most Allied tank guns. O'Brien was about to prove them wrong. Brooklyn Brawler surged forward, its 9-cylinder radial engine screaming. German gunners, surprised by the aggressive move, fired repeatedly, rounds clanging off the Lee's frontal armor. One penetrated the bow, killing Private Chen at his machine gun, but the tank kept coming. 150 yards, Mitchell had the center Panzer III perfectly lined up. Fire! The armor-piercing round struck the German tank's mantlet at point-blank range, the kinetic energy driving through hardened steel like a nail through wood. The Panzer III's ammunition cooked off in a secondary explosion that tore the tank apart from the inside. Colonel Waters, watching from his command tank, immediately understood O'Brien's tactic. He broadcast to all remaining units: "All Lees advance, close the range, engage at under 200 yards." It was a desperate gamble, but despair was all they had left. The surviving M3 Lees lurched forward in a ragged line, their engines roaring, tracks throwing up mud. The German anti-tank gunners in the olive grove, expecting the Americans to retreat, suddenly found themselves under direct assault from vehicles they'd been trained to engage at distance. The Lee's height, its most criticized feature, now became an advantage. The tank commanders, standing in their turrets, had clear lines of sight over the low vegetation. They directed their gunners onto targets with increasing accuracy as the range closed. Private Kowalski was loading rounds as fast as his hands could move, the spent shell casings piling up around his feet. Mitchell fired, loaded, fired again, the 75mm gun becoming burning hot from repeated use. Another Panzer III exploded. A Pak 38 anti-tank gun was crushed under the tracks of a charging Lee, its crew scattering into the olive trees. The American infantry, watching the tank's suicidal charge, found their courage reignited. Companies from the Big Red won fixed bayonets and followed the Lees forward, their Springfield rifles barking, grenades arcing toward German positions. The battle devolved into a close-quarters brawl that lasted 40 brutal minutes. The Germans, veteran soldiers all, fought with skill and determination. But they had been caught off guard by the American aggression, by the willingness of these green crews to close to knife-fighting range where the Lee's powerful gun could do devastating work. The last Panzer III took 3 hits almost simultaneously from different Lees, its crew bailing out with their uniforms smoking. German infantry began withdrawing in good order, carrying their wounded, their anti-tank guns left behind in the olive grove. By 1600 hours, the village and Point 186 were in American hands. As the smoke cleared and medics moved among the wounded, the true cost became apparent. The 1st Armored Division had lost 6 M3 Lees destroyed and 4 more damaged. 23 American tankers were dead, another 31 wounded. The Big Red 1 Infantry had taken casualties as well, 11 killed, 26 wounded. But they had destroyed 5 Panzer IIIs, captured 4 Pak 38 anti-tank guns, and driven a veteran German force from a key position. More importantly, they had proven something that would echo through the North African campaign and beyond. Sergeant O'Brien, his face blackened with smoke and his hands shaking from adrenaline, climbed out of Brooklyn Brawler to find Colonel Waters waiting. The tank had taken 17 hits. Its armor was scarred and dented, the right track damaged, and blood from Private Chen's wounds stained the bow gunner's position. But it had survived, and it had killed. Waters recommended O'Brien for the Silver Star. The citation would read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy." O'Brien would survive the war, return to Brooklyn, and never speak about this day except to his closest friends. The M3 Lee would go on to serve with distinction throughout the North African campaign. When news of the action at Point 186 spread through Allied forces, attitudes began to shift. British tank crews, who had derided the Grant version in the early days, developed grudging respect for the platform. Soviet forces, receiving Lees through Lend-Lease, used them effectively on the Eastern Front, particularly appreciating the powerful 75mm gun. The Lee was never perfect. It remained tall, vulnerable, and tactically limited by that sponson-mounted gun. But it was available when nothing else was, and in the hands of determined crews willing to adapt their tactics to its strengths, it proved devastatingly effective. By late 1943, as the M4 Sherman began replacing Lees in frontline service, over 6,000 M3 Lees and Grants had been produced. They had bought time for American industry to refine designs, time for crews to gain experience, time for the arsenal of democracy to build the tanks that would ultimately crush the Third Reich. Erwin Rommel, in his papers captured after the war, made note of American tanks encountered in Tunisia. Of the M3 Lee, he wrote, "A curious design, but when handled aggressively, more dangerous than intelligence had suggested." That might have been the greatest compliment the maligned tank ever received. The men who climbed into M3 Lees knew they were driving a compromise, a stopgap, a tank that would never be celebrated like the Sherman or feared like the Tiger. But they drove them anyway, fought in them anyway, and died in them anyway. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Because every tank, every soldier, every battle mattered in the struggle that defined a generation and shaped our world.